What is up, IF Warriors? It's your boy Edward V, and I want to talk about this specific topic because CBS has done 3 videos in the last 2 or 3 days specifically targeting intermittent fasting and stating that intermittent fasting isn't efficient or isn't necessary or doesn't work, whatever the case may be, whatever kind of theme that they're doing. It's obviously an anti-intermittent fasting push. Not saying that they have any agenda as to why they're pushing behind it. Sometimes it makes sense when something is popular to play devil's advocate so that your content is a little bit different, and then people will go and watch your content and see what's the other side of the spectrum. But in their breakdown and explanation, there are many problems with it. For one is the mislabeling of intermittent fasting in and of itself. Because everyone bunches everything together when it comes to intermittent fasting, those who do not fully understand the nuance of how broken down intermittent fasting is will think that if a news show with a doctor on it is saying, hey, intermittent fasting doesn't work because of X, Y, and Z, then they would take it at face value that it doesn't work because of X, Y, and Z, or that it can be negative to even use. But the more important elements were when they were talking to the doctor, which is Dr. Angus. And one of the 3 videos that they put out, there's one of the casters that is stating that he utilizes intermittent fasting. And he uses a method which they call the time restricted eating, but it's 16 hours of fasting and 8 hours of eating. And he's stating that he's had benefits using this specific method. And one of the things that stood out to me was that the doctor immediately said, yeah, what you're doing is fine. There's nothing wrong with that. And then he kind of talks further into what he doesn't like about intermittent fasting. And what he states is that the things that don't work or the things that are negative for you is when you fast for prolonged periods of time, or when you binge for 5 days and then you don't eat for 2 days. And that's where the confusion happens, because intermittent fasting and how it's more predominantly used is daily fasting, is doing intermittent fasting intraday, every single day, with a 16-hour fasting window or a 20-hour fasting window or a 23-hour fasting window. And when asked, hey, this is the method that I do, a 16-8 method, he said that the 16-8 method is fine. And what he believes is not fine is a 5-day fast or 5 days of binging and 2 days of fasting. And I somewhat agree with him with those comments. But what creates confusion is that for the doctor, he's clearly setting parameters for what he thinks is healthy and what he thinks is very unhealthy. And he clearly thinks that some protocols within intermittent fasting are healthy. And it appears that what he thinks are healthy are the intraday protocols where you fast and eat every day. But he thinks other methods like prolonged fasting and 5-2 diet are not healthy. But when he says the studies show that fasting increases cortisol because of the stress, that is not actually true. There are many studies that looked at athletes and non-athletes. One study looked at rugby players who were under the stress of performing at a high-level sport while not eating and only consuming water, and their cortisol levels did not go up. They've even looked at people doing strength training and their cortisol levels did not go up. The only study that actually showed a heavy cortisol level increase was when they did a prolonged fast for 5 days. On the 5th day, it was detected that cortisol levels had gone up, but every day prior, it did not. So the body was not even feeling that stress until that 5th day. So maybe Dr. Angus is talking about the 5-day structure, but the way he's talking makes you believe that if you don't know anything about intermittent fasting or how nuanced it is or how many different types there are, you would just take that as a blanket statement and say intermittent fasting in and of itself raises cortisol levels. And that is not the case. And as a matter of fact, many studies, even the study that I recently referenced with women, and women in terms of intermittent fasting usually get a lot of flack. So I love how when this study came out, it showed stuff like oxidative stress was reduced, and oxidative stress can lend to raising cortisol. So cortisol was not increased and oxidative stress was decreased. He also states that studies are finding that people who graze throughout the day have a higher risk for type 2 diabetes than people who don't graze. He's essentially saying if you don't eat throughout the day, you have a higher possibility of not getting type 2 diabetes based on the studies that we have available. So what's the best case scenario for that? Intermittent fasting, where you're literally eliminating that based on the protocol. So you see how what he's saying can actually scare you into not doing intermittent fasting fasting, but in reality, he's not talking about intermittent fasting in and of itself. He's talking about specific variations within intermittent fasting. But the most upsetting thing is that the news presents it as a blanket statement, but it's not. He also talks about studies that show the LDL cholesterol does not go down, which is considered the bad cholesterol. And just because it doesn't go down doesn't mean that intermittent fasting is worse than eating 3 meals a day, breakfast, lunch, and dinner, because that also doesn't lower LDL. And no one is stating that intermittent fasting literally heals all health problems. No, it heals many health problems. It assists with many health problems, but it doesn't heal every single health problem that exists. Also, the HDL cholesterol, the good cholesterol, does indeed go up with intermittent fasting, as many recent and even studies in the past have shown. Also, he talks about that rodent studies were what everyone is jumping on the ship for. It's about the studies with the mice. No, the studies with the mice were what intrigued people like me back 5 years ago when intermittent fasting was brand new. It intrigued me, I tried it and I loved it, but recently, in these past 2 years, we have gotten so many human studies that are corroborating many of the rodent studies that we've seen. There are many studies that show positive health benefits in humans when intermittent fasting, and also positive fat burning elements when intermittent fasting as well. And he stated about calories in versus calories out, which I've always stated will always apply. If you want to reduce weight, you have to be at a negative energy balance. There's nothing that you can do about that. But what intermittent fasting does is it actually helps you burn body fat predominantly as the calories that you're choosing to remove from your body to provide that energy for you. One thing that he kind of threw me off on was that he stated if you do not eat, your insulin goes up. And that is 100% not the case. Your insulin goes up in the presence of glucose. If you're introducing glucose into your body, that is the reason your insulin even moves. Your insulin moves to break down that glucose and move it through the bloodstream and deliver it to your brain, to your liver, to provide energy to those body functions. So if you don't eat, your body doesn't anticipate that you will eat and raise insulin. Insulin doesn't get raised unless you're actually eating. Now, I don't want to discredit doctors. He knows what he's doing in terms of being a doctor, but simply because he's on CBS News and he's a doctor doesn't mean he necessarily knows about the studies involving intermittent fasting. He might know about some studies involving intermittent fasting with rodents, but he clearly doesn't understand the studies that have recently come out where almost all of them across the board are showing lower oxidative stress and no cortisol increase, unless he's only looking at specific studies like a 5-day fast that increases cortisol. But to use those studies and say that intermittent fasting in and of itself is showing to raise cortisol, that's a little misleading in my opinion. And if you must have a doctor's opinion on the matter, he is a medical doctor and he specializes in medicine. He is actually the co-founder of Navigenics, which is a personalized medicine company. And this is not to discredit him, but it's to show where his focus in the medical field lies. It isn't on dieting and eating tactics. If you're one of those people that must listen to a doctor, a better doctor to look at is a research doctor, ones that actually perform and run studies looking into different things like intermittent fasting, for example. And one perfect doctor that you can look at is Dr. Stephen Anton. I've interviewed him on this channel and he's given amazing points about the 16 clinical trials that he's done in the past showing positive effects with intermittent fasting versus simply just caloric restriction. And he continues to further push into studies looking at intermittent fasting. I wanted to touch on this video because a lot of people were asking me, oh my gosh, CBS is saying that intermittent fasting doesn't work, or CBS is saying that it only works for the short term, not the long term. CBS is saying this, CBS is saying that. So I needed to make a video to clear the information that was given by Dr. Angus. The issue that we're having now is that people are becoming more strategical in their way of trying to bring down intermittent fasting. What they do is they'll say intermittent fasting doesn't work, but then they'll go into the whole intermittent fasting umbrella and pick out certain protocols that don't work or show negative effects and say these things happen during the intermittent fasting process. And that throws everyone off because the majority of people are not doing 5-day fast. The majority of people are doing 1 meal a day or 20 hours fasting or 16 hours fasting. That's intermittent fasting. 5-day fast to me should not be considered intermittent fasting. That should be considered prolonged fasting. But I digress. So I I hope this video was informative for you. Do want to let you know that this video is sponsored by Flex Pro Meals, an awesome meal service providing company that delivers the meals at your front door. So no more having to track calories or count macros or any of that. You can select any of the foods that you want based on what you prioritize, higher carbs, higher protein, whatever you like. They even have a keto diet menu. It'll be delivered to your front door. You throw it in the microwave for 3 minutes and you'll have yourself a full-on meal without all of the hassles of portioning, counting calories, counting your macros. It's a perfect system to help you if you're struggling with calories and macros. And of course, I want to thank my patrons from my Patreon. I'm gonna put their names right up here. And as always, guys, I'll see you on Wednesday for another FAQ. Peace.